The first thing I noticed was the quiet confidence in Mark Davidson's office, the kind that comes from believing the room belongs to you. His desk was polished to a mirror shine, the kind of mahogany that makes everything feel expensive, untouchable, final. He didn't invite me to sit. He just watched me the way you watch a line item you're about to cut, then delivered the message with a calm that almost sounded rehearsed. A department restructure, he called it. My role would be eliminated next month, not a performance issue, not a discussion, not even an apology. Just a decision wrapped in corporate language served with a smile he tried to hide and failed. Then he added the part that made my stomach go cold, not because it shocked me, but because it revealed exactly who he had become. Before I left, I would be expected to train my replacement. Her name was Jennifer. She would start tomorrow. I should show her everything about how the marketing division works. Everything. As if 12 years of building trust with clients, rescuing campaigns at midnight, and protecting the brand when leadership stumbled could be transferred like a password. I kept my face neutral because that is what people like Mark mistake for weakness. Inside, though, a different story was playing. Not the story he believed where I was a loyal employee being quietly pushed aside. The real story had begun long before this meeting, back when the company still felt like a place you could be proud of. It started with Robert Davidson, Mark's father, the founder who led like he meant it. Robert had a way of seeing talent before it was obvious, and he treated potential like an investment worth making. Under him, I grew from a junior associate into the person clients asked for by name, the one they trusted to tell the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Years ago, when he promoted me, he said something that stuck to my ribs. Success is not just about profit, it is about building something that matters. Then Robert died suddenly, the kind of loss that rearranges a company and a family in the same breath. Mark took the chair, and in months, the place began to change. Mentorship became politics. Innovation became shortcuts. The culture Robert protected was replaced by a glossy, fragile thing held together by ego and favoritism. People who cared left first. Then, clients started asking harder questions. Then, the numbers began to tilt. And somewhere in that slow collapse, I made a choice that still felt heavy. When I thought about it, I would not let Robert's legacy be gutted in silence. I would not let the company become a playground for someone who treated people like disposable tools. So while Mark congratulated himself, I did my work. Quietly, patiently, legally. The kind of work that does not show up in a meeting invite until it is already too late to stop it. When Mark told me to train Jennifer, he thought he was handing me a final humiliation, a forced goodbye with a bow on top. What he did not know was that every polite nod I gave him was not surrender. It was timing, because tomorrow morning, the story he is telling himself about power control and inheritance is going to collide with a different story, one built on receipt signatures and the kind of leverage that does not raise its voice. So here is the question that matters now. When the person who tried to erase you learns you have been holding the keys all along, do you choose revenge or do you choose justice that leaves the company stronger than before? When I walked out of Mark's office, I kept my pace steady, the same measured stride I used when a campaign launch went sideways, and everyone looked to me for the calm solution. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed and the carpet muffled my footsteps like the building itself was trying to pretend nothing had happened. I passed framed photos of product launches, old team celebrations, and a glossy portrait of Mark shaking hands with someone important, the kind of photo he loved, because it made him look like he belonged there. 12 years. That number landed in my chest as if it had weight. I'd given this place my 20s and most of my 30s. I'd learned the language of stakeholders, the rhythm of quarterly targets, and the unspoken rules of how to keep a company's reputation intact when leadership made the kind of mistakes you cannot admit out loud. And I remembered a very different version of this company, one that did not feel like a stage built for Mark's ego. In the beginning, Davidson Tech felt like a workshop, not a throne room. Robert Davidson, the founder, ran it like the future mattered. He wore simple suits, showed up early, and knew people by name. Not just executives, but the woman who fixed the printer jam on the third floor the engineer who stayed late to test a prototype, the junior account rep who froze during her first client pitch. Robert noticed effort. He rewarded curiosity. He asked questions that made you better. I was 23 when I started a junior marketing associate with a notebook full of ideas and a voice that still shook when I spoke in meetings. Robert could have overlooked me. Instead, he pushed me into rooms I was not sure I deserved to enter. He gave me feedback that stung, then stayed late to explain why it mattered. He made it clear that you did not have to be born into power to earn a place at the table. I still hear his voice, sometimes steady and warm, telling me that building something meaningful was not a slogan, it was a responsibility. Over the years, he became more than a boss. He was a mentor, the kind you do not replace once you lose them. And when he promoted me to director, he said it like a promise, not a favor. He believed in me, and for a while the company felt like it believed in all of us. Then Robert died. No gradual goodbye, no long handoff. One day, he was there speaking about the next product roadmap, and the next day, the building felt colder. Grief did not just hit the family, it hit the entire organization. People moved quietly, like they were afraid their footsteps might offend his memory. Mark stepped into the CEO role, as if it had always been his, as if the title alone gave him wisdom. At first, we tried to be fair. We told ourselves he was grieving too. We made space for awkward decisions and rough edges, but grief did not explain what came next. Mark did not inherit his father's patience. He inherited his father's power and used it like a weapon. The first thing he dismantled was the culture. He replaced mentorship with competition. He replaced transparency with whispers. He began rewarding loyalty to him, not excellence for the company. Meetings shifted from problem-solving to performance theater. People stopped bringing bad news because bad news got punished. Employees who had built the company's foundation were suddenly described as expensive, outdated, replaceable. Mark started hiring people who reminded him of himself, confident, loud, connected, but thin on substance. There were the golf buddies who arrived with big titles and vague responsibilities, and the social friends who laughed too hard at his jokes and called it leadership. The company's identity shifted from building to extracting. Short-term wins became everything. If a strategy looked good on a slide deck, Mark loved it even if it broke client trust in real life. And I watched the damage spread like a slow leak. A major client called me one evening, voice tight, asking why our deliverables had changed without discussion. Another client quietly moved their renewal meeting forward, which is corporate code for they are already looking at your competitors. Our brand, the one I had protected for years, started to feel like it was slipping out of my hands. That was the first betrayal, not Mark firing me, but Mark taking what his father built and treating it like disposable property. The second betrayal was more personal. Mark began rewriting history. He talked about Robert as if Robert had been naive, too soft, too sentimental. He implied that the company had succeeded despite those values, not because of them. And every time he did it, something in me tightened like a knot forming around a truth I could not ignore. I was not just watching a company decline, I was watching a legacy be mocked. I tried at first the reasonable ways. I brought data. I brought client feedback. I proposed gradual reforms that would restore trust without making Mark lose face. He listened with a polite smile and then did whatever he wanted anyway. I tried going to the board, the older members who had served under Robert, but Mark had spent years sidelining them. Some were tired, some were afraid, some had been pushed into irrelevance so slowly they did not even notice it happening. I realized I could keep fighting on the inside and lose, or I could change the rules of the fight without breaking the law or my own ethics. That is when I started building options. Not fantasies, not sabotage, not anything that would harm people. Options. I met with a financial advisor, then a corporate lawyer named James Chen, the kind of lawyer who never raises his voice because he does not need to. I asked one question quietly, like I was asking for directions, but it was the most serious question of my life. What does it take to protect a company when the person steering it refuses to see the cliff? James did not flinch. He laid out legal pathways, governance realities, shareholder rights, board procedures, disclosure obligations, and the difference between influence and control. He was careful with every word, and I was careful with every decision. I did not want revenge that burned the place down. I wanted accountability that rebuilt it. Over the next months, I did what I had always done in marketing. I planned, researched, tested, and moved patiently. I tracked performance, employee turnover, client churn, and the patterns Mark could not hide behind charisma. I connected with former employees who had left and listened to what they had experienced. I kept everything documented, not for gossip, but for truth. My best friend at work, Maya, the head of HR, became my anchor. Maya had watched good people get pushed out for refusing to flatter Mark. She had sat across from employees in exit interviews, hearing the same story again and again: fear, exhaustion, and the feeling that the company no longer recognized them. When I told Maya I was exploring a legal path to stabilize the company, she did not ask me if I was serious. She asked me what I needed. She was one of the few people who could see the human cost behind the spreadsheets, and she reminded me in the hardest moments that doing the right thing could still hurt. Then, Jennifer entered the picture, not because she was special, but because Mark needed a symbol. He wanted to replace me with someone he could control. Someone flashy. Someone who would call his reckless decisions visionary. He recruited her from a competitor and announced it like a victory, as if hiring a new face could erase the trust I had built for years. And when he ordered me to train her, he thought he was humiliating me. What he really did was hand me a perfect measure of his arrogance. He assumed I had nowhere to go and no power to answer back. He assumed the story ended with him. It did not. Because while he prepared his victory lap, there were documents waiting in James's office, the kind that do not care about ego. There were board members who still remembered Robert's principles, the ones Mark thought he had silenced. There were numbers that could not be spun anymore, and there was a choice I had already made to fight for the company the right way, with legality, transparency, and outcomes that would speak louder than any threat. That afternoon, after Mark's announcement, Maya stepped into my office and closed the door softly, the way you do when you are about to say something that changes everything. She looked at my face, then at the empty chair across from me, then back again, and I could see the question in her eyes, not fear, but readiness. I breathed in steady and told her the next step was already in motion. Tomorrow would not be another day of pretending. Tomorrow would be the day the truth walked into the room and sat at the head of the table. By the time Jennifer arrived the next morning, the building already felt like a set I'd walked through 1,000 times, only now I could see the hidden rigging behind the walls. She stood in the lobby like she owned the air-tailored suit, sharp heels, a resume that looked impressive until you read between the lines. Mark had sold her arrival as a bold new chapter, but I'd learned that people who brag about boldness usually mean recklessness. I greeted her warmly anyway, because the fastest way to expose someone's understanding is to give them room to talk. In my office, I opened the marketing dashboard and started with the basics: retention metrics, lifetime value, client health scores, the cadence of renewals, the relationships that weren't written down but kept the revenue steady. Jennifer's eyes skimmed the numbers like they were clutter. She kept interrupting, tossing out aggressive acquisition ideas that sounded shiny and hollow, the kind you pitch when you don't have to live with the fallout. I nodded, wrote notes, asked follow-up questions in a tone that sounded curious, and let her hang herself with assumptions. Every time she dismissed client loyalty as old-fashioned, she confirmed what my background research suggested. She was trained in a culture that treated people like targets, not partners. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I simply kept documenting what she said, because power isn't just it's what you can prove later without raising your voice. While she talked, my phone buzzed in my pocket with a message from James Chen, Papers filed, board members notified, meeting set. The words didn't make my heart race the way they might have months ago. That adrenaline had already burned off during long nights of planning, the kind where you stare at spreadsheets until the numbers feel like a language you can hear. What I felt now was clarity, the calm that comes from knowing you've done the work, and the rest is timing. I excused myself from Jennifer with the same polite professionalism Mark had expected, and I left her surrounded by the very material she thought she was there to replace: campaign briefs, client notes, and a binder of strategy that took years to build. As I walked to the conference room, I mentally reviewed the plans we'd been setting for months. Not traps, not tricks, but stabilizers, quiet supports that would hold when the room turned chaotic. The first plant was information. I'd built a performance narrative that couldn't be dismissed as emotion client churn trends mapped against leadership decisions, turnover data tied to specific departments. Mark had politicized a timeline of dropped initiatives that Robert had once considered core. The second plant was people. Maya had been carefully reconnecting with staff. Mark had sidelined, not promising them revenge, but offering them something far more motivating: a path back to meaningful work. She'd created a confidential channel for employees to share concerns and suggestions without fear, which did two things at once: it rebuilt trust, and it generated a factual record of workplace impact. The third plant was governance. James had reached out to board members who'd been pushed into ceremonial roles, the ones who still remembered what Robert valued, and quietly reminded them of their responsibilities. Not in a dramatic way, just in a precise legal way that made it easy for them to step back into relevance without feeling like they were betraying anyone. And the fourth plant was visibility, because reputations aren't rebuilt in secret. I'd already drafted a communication plan that focused on stability, continuity, and a return to values, a plan that spoke to employees and clients without naming villains, without turning it into a spectacle. The goal was never to humiliate Mark publicly. The goal was to stop the bleeding and restore credibility before rumors could do more damage than mismanagement had already done. In the conference room, Mark's voice was already raised as he argued into his phone, outraged that a board meeting could happen without his permission. That line, his assumption that authority was the same as control, told me everything about why he was about to lose. I took my seat at the head of the table before anyone could think to question it, and I waited, letting silence do the work that anger never could. Board members filed in, some with guarded expressions, some with relief they tried to hide. They were the old guard, the ones Robert had trusted, the ones Mark had treated like dusty furniture. When James arrived, folder in hand, the room shifted. Paper has a kind of gravity that charisma can't fight. Mark demanded explanations. I gave none at first. I let James distribute documents because the order mattered. First, ownership, then filings, then the plain language summary that made it impossible to misunderstand. When I finally stood, I didn't deliver a speech. I delivered a timeline. 3 months ago, a holding company acquired a controlling interest. This morning, everything was finalized and properly recorded. Mark tried to laugh it off, tried to claim it was impossible, tried to reduce me to my job title, like titles were limits instead of labels. I didn't correct him with pride. I corrected him with facts. I explained the years of careful investment, the disciplined purchases, the legal structure, the compliance, the thresholds, the patience. I didn't describe it as a coup. I described it as stewardship. Then I placed a photo of Robert on the table, not to guilt anyone, but to anchor the room to what mattered. Robert built this company on innovation, integrity, and respect. Under Mark, those values had been traded for short-term optics. The numbers proved it. The culture proved it. The client departures proved it. And if we were serious about restoring this company, we needed leadership that understood sustainable growth isn't built by fear. Mark sputtered about lawyers. James calmly offered documentation, and as the paper trail unfolded, I watched the board members' faces change from confusion to recognition. This wasn't a personal dispute anymore. It was governance doing what governance is meant to do when a company is in decline. When the vote came, it didn't take long. The decision wasn't fueled by drama. It was fueled by reality. Mark was removed from leadership, and yes, security escorted him out when he refused to leave. But what stayed with me wasn't his shouting. It was the quiet after the collective exhale of a room that finally felt like it could reset. The moment the door closed behind him, the real work began. I went straight to the plants we'd prepared. First, Jennifer. Her contract wasn't finalized, and I handled it without spectacle. I met with her briefly, outlined the misalignment between her approach and the company's direction, and gave her a clean professional exit option. She took it fast because people who climb quickly know when the ladder has moved. Next, we began rebuilding from the inside out. Maya and I reviewed departments not as org charts, but as living systems. We identified high performers who'd been blocked, and we scheduled listening sessions where people could speak without being punished for honesty. We restarted the mentorship program Robert had valued not as a nostalgic gesture, but as a pipeline for leadership that wasn't based on proximity to the CEO. We reopened the innovation lab Mark had shut down, and we tied it to measurable outcomes so no one could call it a vanity project. We also repaired client relationships deliberately. I called key accounts, personally acknowledged the instability without oversharing, and explained the new leadership's commitment to consistency and ethics. We didn't promise miracles. We promised transparency and follow-through, and then we delivered quick wins that proved our words weren't performative. Meanwhile, the rumor mill tried to spin up because Mark wasn't the type to leave quietly. He floated stories about instability and illegitimacy. But rumors collapse when the facts are boring and consistent. So we became boring in the best way. Steady deliverables, clear updates, improved response times, better product feedback loops, and a visible return of talent that people recognized and trusted. Over weeks, employee engagement rose, then client confidence stabilized, then the numbers stopped sliding. That's the thing about real power. It doesn't need to shout. It shows up as outcomes. And throughout it all, I kept one question close, the one that guided every decision I made from that day forward. Could I rebuild this company in a way that would make Robert proud without becoming the kind of leader Mark had been? Because winning a board vote is easy compared to earning trust back. And trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt by choices repeated quietly until the culture changes for real. The first week after the leadership change felt like waking up after a storm and realizing the house is still standing, but the roof needs work you can't ignore. People smiled more in the hallways. Yes, and meetings stopped feeling like a courtroom, but the deeper damage didn't disappear just because Mark's name was no longer on the door. The company had been running on fear for years. Fear doesn't vanish overnight. It hides in habits. It shows up when someone hesitates before speaking. It shows up when a manager asks for permission instead of offering ideas. It shows up when talented people wait for the other shoe to drop. Because in a toxic environment, good news never feels safe. I tried to move carefully because I'd seen leaders rush into reform the way some people rush into renovations, tearing down walls without checking what's load-bearing. I didn't want to break what was still holding. But the truth was, we didn't get a clean reset. We inherited a mess. And within days, the mess started pushing back. It began with a pattern I should have anticipated. Mark's allies didn't leave quietly. Some of the executives he'd promoted were still in place, and they wore loyalty like armor. They smiled. In meetings, agreed with new priorities, and then stalled quietly in the background. Projects missed deadlines for vague reasons. Approvals got lost. Decisions that should have taken one day took a week. It wasn't open rebellion. It was something more corrosive, passive resistance dressed as process. Maya brought me a list of oddities, small at first, then too many to ignore. Expense approvals that didn't match policy. Vendor contracts signed with unusual terms. A consulting firm hired at a premium rate with deliverables that read like fluff. When we dug deeper, the pattern sharpened into a possibility I didn't like. Mark hadn't just made bad leadership decisions. He'd built systems that made accountability difficult, and he'd placed people in positions where they could protect each other. That's what made the next discovery feel like a punch to the throat, not because it surprised me, but because it raised the stakes beyond culture and morale. A finance team lead requested a private meeting, the kind where the door closes gently and nobody looks directly at the camera in the corner. She didn't accuse anyone outright. She didn't need to. She slid a folder across the desk hands, slightly trembling, and said she was worried about irregularities in how certain budgets had been categorized. "I don't want to make assumptions," she said, "but I can't reconcile these line items." In the past, under Mark, that conversation would have ended with her being transferred or pushed out or branded as difficult. Now, it ended with me thanking her and feeling the weight of responsibility settle like stone. Because saving the company wasn't just about putting the right person in the CEO chair. It was about facing whatever had been hidden while everyone was afraid to look. James Chen advised immediate caution. Not panic, caution. We needed internal controls, independent review, and careful language. We needed to separate facts from suspicion. We needed to protect employees from retaliation and protect the company from self-inflicted chaos. The temptation in moments like this is to make a dramatic public stand, to declare that you're cleaning house and naming names. But drama is not governance. Governance is slow, precise, and sometimes painfully quiet. So we initiated an external audit with a reputable firm and tightened authorization rules across departments. That alone was enough to trigger backlash. People who benefited from the old system hate sunlight. Suddenly, anonymous posts appeared online whispering about instability. A former executive, one of Mark's favorites, started hinting in industry circles that the company was being run by someone with no real executive experience. The irony would have been funny if it weren't dangerous. Because the rumors didn't just attack me, they attacked confidence. And confidence is a fragile thing in business. Clients don't always leave because you fail. Sometimes they leave because they're afraid you will. Within 2 weeks, a major client asked to renegotiate their contract terms, citing uncertainty. Another delayed signing a renewal. Sales flagged multiple deals that had suddenly cooled. Our competitors were watching like vultures circling a wounded animal, ready to swoop in and sell a cleaner narrative. That was my first real drop. The moment I realized leadership was no longer just a strategic role. It was a constant crisis of perception. Every morning, I opened my email expecting a new fire. Every afternoon, I was pulled into meetings that began with reassurance and ended with more work. I started sleeping lightly, waking at 3 a.m., with my brain running through scenarios I couldn't control. Then came the twist that tested me in a way Mark never could. The audit revealed early signals of questionable contracting practices during Mark's tenure. Not a neat cinematic smoking gun. Real life is messier than that. It was a web of decisions that looked irresponsible at best and unethical at worst, with a few individuals positioned to deflect blame if anything ever surfaced. And as the board reviewed preliminary findings, some members flinched. Not because they didn't want accountability, but because they feared the consequences. Legal exposure, shareholder reaction, public headlines, the kind that don't care about nuance. One board member said what others were thinking. If this becomes public, it could hurt the company more than it helps. That sentence was a mirror held up to my own fear. Because it forced a question I hadn't wanted to face yet. Was I willing to do the right thing even if it cost us in the short term? Even if it made me unpopular? Even if it made the turnaround slower? I understood the risk, but I also understood something deeper. If we protected the past, we would become its accomplice. And if we built a new culture on avoidance, it would collapse the moment the next storm arrived. I asked James to outline our ethical and legal obligations and to recommend a path that prioritized compliance, transparency, and employee protection. Maya focused on internal communication because people could feel tension even if they didn't know the details. She created safe check-ins for teams, gave managers scripts that avoided rumors without lying, and emphasized stability and support. Still, the strain showed. A product lead snapped in a meeting exhausted. A junior analyst cried in the bathroom after hearing whispers about layoffs that weren't even planned. The ghost of Mark's regime still haunted us because once people are conditioned to fear, silence becomes their default. And then on a Friday evening, when the office had mostly emptied, I found myself alone in what used to be Mark's office, staring at Robert's old photo on the desk. The building was quiet, but my head wasn't. I felt the pressure of choices layered on choices. I'd fought to gain control, and now control had revealed a truthership isn't a prize. It's a burden you accept when you're willing to take responsibility for what others would rather ignore. My phone buzzed. A message from Maya. 2 managers asked if Mark is coming back. They're scared. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. That fear wasn't just about Mark, it was about trust. People needed to know they were safe. Not safe from consequences, but safe from unpredictability, humiliation, and being treated like disposable parts. I took a breath and made a decision that would shape everything next. We would not cover for the past. We would not chase headlines. We would do this properly, even if it hurt. We would communicate carefully, act ethically, and rebuild credibility through consistency. The next Monday, I addressed the leadership team with a firmness that surprised even me. I didn't name individuals. I didn't spill confidential details. I said we were strengthening controls, reviewing vendor relationships, and committing to a culture where concerns could be raised without punishment. And I made one promise, simple and non-negotiable: nobody would be retaliated against for telling the truth. That promise changed the air in the room. Not instantly, but enough that a few people stopped looking at the floor. Enough that someone finally asked the question they'd been swallowing for years. What happens if the truth is worse than we think? I answered honestly. Then we face it and we fix it. Because at that point, the turnaround wasn't about beating Mark. It was about building a company that didn't need someone like Mark to learn what integrity means. By the time the audit process moved from whispers to structure, the company didn't feel like it was in a crisis anymore. It felt like it was in a test. Not the kind you pass with a clever presentation, but the kind you pass with discipline when nobody is clapping. The board wanted certainty. Employees wanted safety. Clients wanted stability. And the industry wanted a story it could repeat at conferences and in private Slack channels, something simple enough to gossip about on a Tuesday afternoon. That's the problem with change. The truth is complex, but rumors are fast. The first wave came internally. People divided not into villains and heroes, but into something more human: those who had suffered under Mark and those who had survived by adapting. Some employees were openly relieved, almost giddy at the return of daylight. They spoke up in meetings for the first time in years. They laughed without checking who was listening. They talked about ideas again. Others stayed cautious, sitting with their shoulders raised, waiting for the moment the company would swing back into old habits. A smaller group, the ones who'd benefited from Mark's favor, didn't lash out publicly. They tried to frame the leadership change as a temporary disruption, a procedural glitch that would be corrected. They asked pointed questions in meetings about chain of command and decision rights, not because they needed clarity, but because they wanted to reassert dominance through process. Maya called it what it was: fear disguised as professionalism. Because for some people, fairness feels like oppression when they've gotten used to special treatment. The second wave came from outside. Mark's name didn't vanish the moment he left. It lingered in people's mouths in investor chats, in the careful tone of clients who didn't want to insult the new leadership. but didn't want to be the last one holding the bag either. Mark began calling favors not always directly, but through intermediaries. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanted coffee. Vendors asked strange questions about our direction. A trade newsletter ran a vague piece about uncertainty at Davidson Tech, filled with anonymous commentary that read like it had been crafted for maximum doubt. It wasn't enough to cause panic, but it was enough to make the air feel thinner. Every small fluctuation became a headline in someone's mind. If a project slipped by a day, someone would whisper that the company was falling apart. If a client asked for a revised contract clause, someone would call it a mass exodus. Anxiety is contagious, and it spreads fastest when people don't feel informed. That's when I learned a hard truth about leadership. Silence creates a vacuum, and the vacuum will be filled by whoever is most willing to talk, not whoever is most accurate. So we didn't respond with drama, we responded with structure, we set a steady communication rhythm, weekly internal updates, clear priorities, a transparent explanation of process changes without turning it into a courtroom. Maya trained managers to speak with confidence without oversharing. We introduced a confidential reporting channel with third-party oversight so employees could raise concerns without fearing personal consequences. And we repeated the same message until it sank into the walls. Accountability is not a witch hunt. It's the foundation of trust. But even with structure, people don't heal on a schedule. Some teams carried resentment, like a private injury. They wanted names. They wanted public consequences. They wanted the satisfaction of seeing the old regime humiliated the way they'd been humiliated. Others feared that any mention of wrongdoing would stain everyone, including the people who had done their jobs honestly. The board fractured along similar lines. A few members pushed for immediate public disclosure of any negative findings, believing transparency was the only way to reclaim credibility. Others argued for containment not because they wanted to protect Mark, but because they feared the market reaction and the legal exposure. In their minds, saving the company meant limiting fallout. In mine, saving the company meant refusing to build a future on denial. James navigated those discussions with surgical care. He reminded everyone that there were legal duties, that governance wasn't optional, and that the safest path was the one that treated the truth like a fact to be addressed, not a scandal to be managed. Still, the tension seeped into the workplace in subtle ways. People asked Maya whether layoffs were coming even when there was no plan for layoffs. New hires seemed hesitant to accept offers asking for additional assurances. A promising candidate declined a leadership role because they'd heard something happened and didn't want to be tied to uncertainty. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed validation, but because it showed how quickly reputations can be shaped by incomplete stories. And then came the moment where the conflict stopped being abstract. Mark's lawyer sent a formal letter, not a lawsuit, but a threat wrapped in legal language. It questioned the process, hinted at claims, and demanded access to internal documents under the pretense of investigation. James read it twice, then looked at me and gave me the blunt truth: it was an intimidation tactic, a way to force us into reaction mode, to make us feel like we were constantly defending ourselves. The old me might have felt the urge to respond emotionally, to write a furious rebuttal, to expose everything Mark had done and let the world judge him. But the leader I was becoming understood that attention is currency, and Mark was trying to make us pay him with it. So we responded the right way: precise, compliant, and uninteresting. James sent a measured reply that acknowledged receipt rejected, improper demands, and outlined the lawful process for any legitimate inquiries. No insults, no threats, just boundaries. And while the legal chess continued quietly, I focused on what mattered: results and healing. We launched listening sessions across departments facilitated by neutral moderators where employees could describe what had changed for them, what they needed, and what they feared. The sessions weren't therapy, but they were human. People talked about being ignored, about watching promotions go to favorites, about losing confidence in their own work, because praise had become political. Some stories were raw enough to make the room feel heavy. Maya took notes. I took notes. And we made policy changes directly tied to those experiences. Clear promotion criteria, transparent performance reviews, training for managers on psychological safety, and a policy against retaliation enforced with actual consequences. We also addressed the outside world through consistent credibility. We met with key clients not to beg them to stay, but to show them the new governance posture and the operational plan. We didn't pretend the past didn't exist. We positioned it as a chapter we were correcting through compliance and improved controls. Slowly, trust began to reappear, not as applause, but as reduced friction. A client renewed without adding extra clauses. A vendor agreed to revise terms. A partner asked about collaborating on a long-term initiative again. Those small signs mattered because they were real. Yet the most difficult part wasn't board politics or external rumors. It was the moral tension inside the company. Some employees wanted to see Mark punished. Some wanted to forget he ever existed. Some had quietly tolerated the old system and now felt guilt, wondering if they'd been complicit by staying silent. And I couldn't offer an easy answer because life doesn't give you clean categories. I could only offer a direction. We were going to be the kind of company that learned from pain instead of repeating it. We were going to treat accountability as a path to stability, not a performance for social media. We were going to build systems that protected people, not personalities. One afternoon, after a long meeting with the board, I walked into the kitchen and saw two employees talking softly. When they noticed me, they stopped the old reflex of fear. I didn't correct them. I just poured coffee and said calmly, "You don't have to stop talking when I enter the room." One of them laughed nervously, then looked at me like she was trying to decide if I meant it. I did. That moment, small as it was, reminded me what rebuilding really is. It isn't one dramatic vote, it's 1,000 small acts of safety repeated until people believe the threat is gone. The company was still healing. The truth was still being processed through the right channels. The outside world still watched hungry for a simple scandal. But inside, something deeper was shifting. People were learning to speak again. And that more than any headline was how we would win. A year's long enough for people to forget the details, but short enough for them to remember the feeling. By the time we reached the next annual meeting, Davidson Tech no longer felt like a company holding its breath. It felt like a place that had learned how to inhale again. The lobby screens didn't just cycle through glossy product shots. They showed real teams, real prototypes, and real outcomes. People walked faster, not from fear, but from momentum. Conversations in the hallways sounded different too. Less whispering, more debating, more problem solving. The kind of noise you only get when people believe their ideas won't be used against them. On paper, the turnaround looked clean. Revenue growth, improved margins, lower turnover, renewed contracts. A handful of clients who drifted away quietly came back. If you only looked at dashboards, you'd think the story ended there as a neat corporate comeback. But the truth was messier, and it deserved to be told that way because the real cost of restoring something meaningful isn't always visible in quarterly reports. It shows up in the nights you don't sleep, the relationships strained by stress, the hard conversations that leave you exhausted for days, and the quiet grief of realizing you can't rewind time to protect everyone who got hurt before the change. There were people we couldn't bring back, talented employees who had already rebuilt their lives elsewhere. There were partnerships that never returned. There were moments when I wondered whether the company would survive the scrutiny we invited by choosing accountability over convenience. And even as the culture improved, the shadow of the old regime remained in small ways: a flinch when a manager asked for feedback, a pause before someone challenged an idea, the learned habit of waiting for punishment that no longer came. That kind of damage doesn't vanish because you want it to. It heals because you keep proving day after day that the rules have changed for real. The twist I never expected was that the hardest part wasn't removing Mark, it was outgrowing him. It would have been easy to turn him into a villain in every retelling, to build my confidence on how wrong he was and how right I had been. But leadership doesn't mature through victory laps. It matures through restraint, through refusing to let bitterness become a management style, through making decisions that would still be defensible if your worst enemy read every email and every policy change. That's what the audit forced us to become. Not perfect, just honest. The external review concluded with findings we could address, and we addressed them. Some vendor relationships were terminated, controls were strengthened, policies were rewritten, a few individuals were removed from positions where they couldn't be trusted with authority. We did it without spectacle, because accountability isn't entertainment, it's a promise you keep. The legal threats Mark floated never became the dramatic lawsuit he wanted them to be. Under real scrutiny, bluster tends to shrink. He tried in quiet ways to keep the story alive, to remind people he once had power, but each month that passed made his narrative less convincing. It's hard to claim a company is unstable when it keeps delivering. It's hard to claim a takeover was illegitimate when every filing is clean and every outcome is measurable. In business, truth doesn't always win quickly, but it wins steadily when you keep the receipts and stay consistent. On the day of the annual meeting, I stood backstage holding a small photo in my hand, the one of Robert Davidson smiling beside me at the company's 10th anniversary. The edges were slightly worn now, the way keepsakes become when you reach for them often. Maya stood beside me, reviewing last-minute details, then looked up and said softly that I didn't need to carry the whole weight alone anymore. I wanted to believe her. I walked onto the stage and faced a room filled with employees I had seen at their best, and their worst employees who had stayed when it was hard, who had left and returned, who had joined, because they sensed a different future here. I didn't open with a victory speech. I opened with a simple truth. This company had lost its way for a while. And it wasn't just the numbers. It was the spirit. The belief that integrity mattered even when nobody was watching. I talked about what we rebuilt, mentorship, innovation, transparent leadership pathways, and a culture where people could raise concerns without fear. Then I showed them what we were building next, a partnership with local schools bringing hands-on STEM programs to communities that had been overlooked, a project that didn't just improve our brand image, but reflected our values in public. The applause that followed wasn't the loudest I'd ever heard, but it was the most meaningful because it felt earned. After the meeting, I returned to my office and found an email waiting. The sender's name made my throat tighten. Margaret Davidson, Robert's widow. I opened it slowly, expecting formality, maybe a polite acknowledgement, maybe nothing at all. Instead, the message was simple and devastating in the best way. She told me she'd been watching the company's progress. She told me Robert had always believed I understood what the company was meant to be. She thanked me for protecting his dream and making it stronger. I read it twice, then sat back in my chair and let the silence settle. That was the real payoff, not watching Mark lose his title, not seeing the board vote swing, not even the financial recovery. The payoff was knowing the company's original purpose had survived not because it was protected by inheritance, but because it was protected by someone willing to do the hard, unglamorous work of stewardship. That evening, as the office emptied, I walked past the wall where Robert's old motto still hung. Success isn't just about making money. It's about building something that matters. I had read those words for years, but now they landed differently. Mark had tried to erase me. He had tried to force me to train my replacement like I was a disposable part. And in doing so, he had pushed me into becoming more than an employee. Not a hero, not a villain. Just a person who decided that fairness and truth were worth the risk. And yet the ending wasn't a clean triumph. Because there is always a cost. I lost the comfort of being just the marketing director. I lost the ease of clocking out mentally when the day ended. I lost a version of myself that could look away from uncomfortable truths. In exchange, I gained something heavier and more valuable: responsibility. The kind that makes you cautious with power because you've seen what happens when the wrong person holds it. The next morning, I arrived early as usual. The building was quiet, but it didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt ready. As the first employees trickled in, I heard the familiar hum of laptops waking up the soft laughter from the kitchen, the sound of a team already debating a product idea in the hallway. I sat at my desk, looked once more at Robert's photo, and understood something I hadn't fully grasped when this began. The best payback isn't humiliation. It's proof. Proof that values can survive greed. Proof that integrity isn't a poster on the wall, it's a series of choices. Proof that the person someone tried to discard can become the person who saves the whole place, not by tearing it down, but by building it back up. And now I'll ask you the question I've been carrying since the day Mark smirked across that desk. If you were in my place, would you chase the satisfaction of revenge, or would you choose the slower path of justice, the one that rebuilds instead of destroys, even when it costs you sleep, comfort, and the easy version of your life?